All right, now welcome back. Welcome back to the Rational Lens podcast, where logic and reasoning comes into focus, and your lens is your third eye, spiritual eye. So we're talking about the two United States, Black Conquistadors, your European Moors of the divine royal bloodline, who made an alliance with these Indo-Germans or Indo-Europeans who were a barbaric tribe, and they assimilated them into the royal bloodline and culture, and they used these Indo-Germans or Indo-Europeans or Indo-Aryans to come over here and colonize and take over resource and land and enslave the indigenous people of the Americas, right? So I explained to y'all what a federation is. I explained to y'all what a confederation is. And now I want to talk about, before we go back, reading in the book, Black Conquistadors. Get this book, Black Conquistadors. Let me tell y'all who wrote the book. I forgot the name. Give me 1 minute. All right. The book is written, Black Conquistadors. The author that wrote it, Mac Perry. Mac Perry is the one that wrote the book, Black Conquistadors. Right? So if y'all want to get this book, it talks about the Black Conquistadors that came over here from Europe, the black nobility family, your elite Moors, who assimilated with these Germanic barbarian tribes, and they formed the alliance, and they came over here, colonized the Americas, and they took land and resource and enslaved the indigenous people who also were black. You understand? So I want to explain to y'all what was the first government, because I already explained what was the first constitution and all that other stuff, and who put that together. And so I want to tell y'all what type of government they had. All right? Give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Let me blow this up. So I can read it and so I can see it. So when we talk about the first government, wasn't this type of government that we're living under now. The government that we're living under now is a federal government where the states are subordinate to a higher power. And that higher power, that higher government is ran by a federal banking reserve system that's being ran by Jewish Zionist people like the Wahlbergs, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds. You understand? These are the people that run your Federal Reserve Bank, which controls the government, which is a federal system. And in that federal system, the states are subordinate to that central power, which is the Federal Reserve. And they are the ones that enslave the people through their labor economically by using fractional banking. That wasn't the first United States. You understand? The first United States, like I said, was a confederation that was under the Article of Confederation. And they had, it started off, they had 14 sovereign states and a political union these 14 states had. They each had their own president. These were black presidents. not white. So when we talk about the 14 black presidents, matter of fact, let me read them to you. So you know you had 14 black presidents before George Washington. George Washington himself was black. So all these people that they were telling you was white, that founded America and built America, were black people. So the 14 presidents of the Continental Congress, which was under the Article of Confederation, right? Let me do this first. Let me give you these people. These were black people. Give me 1 minute so I can put this together. Because these people are important to know, and they don't tell us about them in history. Right? So it says the 14 presidents before George Washington. AI overview, right? It says there were 7 presidents under the Article of Confederation. I told you the Article of Confederation was the first type of government. It was a confederation, not a federal system. It was a confederation system, a political union of sovereign states that came together, that had treaties with each other. Who create treaties? These Native Americans. Your Choctaw, your Chickasaw, your Cherokee, your Seminoles. These were your 5 civilized tribes, right? Let's go through the 5 civilized tribes again, man. The 5 civilized tribes are your Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, which was known as the Creek, and the Seminoles, right? It says the Native American nations in southeastern United States known for adopting aspects of Anglo-American culture in the 18th and 19th century. You understand? Such as written languages, centralized governments, right? And Christianity. The term is now considered demeaning due to its implication that only these 5 tribes were civilized. It wasn't only those 5 tribes were civilized. The whole North America, South America, and Central America and the indigenous people of those lands were civilized. And we got the pyramids, we got the temples, you understand, and all that to prove that these people were civilized, because they knew about engineering, they knew about building, they knew about agriculture, they knew about math and science. They had calendars mathematically in tune with the sun, moon, and stars. You understand? So these people were civilized. And they also were civilizers of Europeans, right? And they lived under a different type of United States of America, which was based on a constitution called the Great Law of Peace, which was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy, right? And they had a government that was called the Article of Confederation of Confederacy, which consists of these 14 presidents that I'm about to tell you about before George Washington. You understand? They lived in peace and harmony with each other, and they traded with each other. They did business with each other. You understand? This was the first America, which was based on inalienable rights, protecting your inalienable rights, which means those rights that were given to you by God. You understand? And they had to go to war with those elite Moors that came from Europe. This was what the American Revolution was about. So let's go back. He was talking about the 14 presidents, right? The 14 presidents before George Washington. Remember, George Washington came later on before these 14 presidents. We're talking about the 14 black presidents before George Washington that was under the Confederate Article of Confederation that had a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. You understand? This is before George Washington. When George Washington came and he was elected into president, he was the one that rewritten the Constitution of the United States, turned it into a federation system, which these states had to be now subordinate under one central power, which was the Federal Reserve, which is the banking system that's being ran by these Zionist Jews, your Rothschilds, your Rockefellers, the Wahlbergs, right? Let's talk about the people that control the Federal Reserve Bank. Let me give you that. Give me 1 minute. Right? It says the premises that the Zionist Jews control the Federal Reserve. That's why they call it a Federal Reserve. Federal means what? We just read it. The word federal comes from the word federatio. The word federatio comes from the word fodua, and there's two meanings. One means to form an alliance with Rome. We know Rome is the Pope, and we know that the Pope controls and runs Washington, D.C. The Pope is one of the most powerfulest people in the world, and it controls all the land on the planet, right? So we're talking about Rome, the Roman Catholic Church. Who did the Roman Catholic Church form an alliance with? They formed an alliance with your Germanic barbarian tribes that invaded the Roman Catholic Empire. And they assimilated them inside the black royal Moorish nobility, which ruled Europe. You understand? And they used these barbarian tribes to colonize and conquer the indigenous people of the Americas, taking their land and their resource and enslaving them under a central government that's being ran by a banking system that practice fractional banking that enslave the people economically and take advantage of their labor by taxing them. You understand? So it says the premises that the Zionist Jews control the Federal Reserve in an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory with no basis in fact. They say no basis in fact, but we know that it is basis in fact because all of the people that run the banking system are Jews. And that Federal Reserve system was put together by your Zionist Jews. Right? It says the Federal Reserve is a government institution led by Board of Governors, nominated by the United States President and confirmed by the Senate, with no religion or ethnic criteria to serve. Right? It says it revived all older trophies, including those from the fabricated text, the protocols of the elders of Zion, which had fueled unfound conspiracy theories about Jewish people controlling international finance, right? How is the Federal Reserve is actually controlled? By the Board of Governors. The Federal Reserve is overseen by 7 members, Board of Governors based in Washington, D.C. So your second United States of America that was put together by George Washington and those founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Quincy Adams, etc. They're the ones that put this federal system in and put the people under the control and power of the Federal Reserve banking system by rewriting the Constitution, right? And moving the headquarters from Philly to Washington, D.C., which is the District of Columbia. And we know that the District of Columbia is controlled by the Pope, which is the Roman Catholic Pope that controls all the land on the planet, right? says the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve System is overseen by 7-member Board of Governors based in Washington, D.C. The governors are nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. They serve staggered 14-year terms to protect them from political pressure. All right. And these are the names of some of the Jewish people that control the Federal Reserve. It says, while the Federal Reserve is not controlled by Jewish people, some Jewish individuals have prominent position at the institution, which is fact often distorted by promoters of conspiracy theory. These individuals served as opponent public office officials, not as representatives of specific religion or ethnical groups. Example, Paul Warburg, a German Jewish immigrant. He was an important figure in the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Janet Yellen, former chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2014 to 2018. Ben Bernanke, former chairman of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2004. Stanley Fletcher, the former vice president of the Federal Reserve from 2014 to 2017. So they're trying to say that it's a conspiracy that the Jews run the Federal Reserve, but they gave you 4 names of Zionist Jews who holds position on the board in the Federal Reserve. But we also know the Rothschilds. We also know the Rockefellers. We also know the Warburgs. You understand? These are all Jewish Zionist groups that had something to do with building the Federal Reserve, that the central government, this federal system that's under a central government that George Washington and the founding fathers put together after they conquered the first United States of America, that was put together by the indigenous Native American people who had a constitution that was based on peace. And they had a government called the Articles of Confederation. Well, I should say they had a government based on Article of Confederation, right? Which was a political union of sovereign states, meaning that each state had their own president, and they came together as a Congress, right? So I hope you understand this. So now let's talk about the 14 presidents before George Washington, right? The 14 presidents before George Washington. There were several presidents under the Article of Confederation. Didn't I told y'all that? Let's see what the Article of Confederation is about before we go and talk about these 14 presidents before George Washington. The Article of Confederation was the first government framework of the United States. Y'all hear that? The Article of Confederation was the first government framework of the United States, ratified between 1777 and 1781. This is before George Washington. This is the first United States that was put together by your indigenous Native Americans who had the Constitution of the Great Law of Peace, which was put together by the Iroquois Confederacy. Right? The Article of Confederation was the first government framework of the United States, ratified between 1777 and 1781. Right? The second United States of America, which was the federal system, being ran by the Federal Reserve, that was put together by George Washington after he rewrote the Constitution and changed the 13th Amendment, right? Was incorporated in 1781. So you had the first United States government that was under the Article of Confederation. It was ratified in 1777 all the way into 1781. And then George Washington and those that have that federal system, they changed the Constitution and they created United States Corporation that was incorporated in 1781, right? It says the Article of Confederation was the first government framework of the United States, ratified in 1777 and 1781, established a weak central government, most power retained by the states. Y'all hear that? Because it was a political union with sovereign states, and the power was in those sovereign states before it was changed into a central government being ran by the Federal Reserve banking system. And all the other states had to be subordinate to this banking system. Right? It says the key aspect included emphasis on state sovereignty, limited power for the central government in areas like taxation, commerce, and unicameral Congress. The Articles were eventually replaced by the United States Constitution in 1789. Y'all hear that? The Article was eventually replaced by the United States Constitution in 1789. 1789 is when George Washington rewrote the Constitution, and they put us under a central government that was being ran by a federal banking system that was being controlled by Zionist Jews, right? And they enslaved the people economically by taxing them and by taking advantage of their labor. Taking the people, turning them into corporations, and using their labor as assets that they put inside of a trust. You understand? This was the form of enslaving the people and taking the sovereign power away from the people. This is what George Washington did, right? It says a key aspect including emphasis on state sovereignty, which means republic power, right? Your alienable rights that's given to you by God. Limited power for central government, meaning that the first government limited power for central government, meaning that the Federal Reserve ain't supposed to have the power over the government that it has now, right? In areas like taxation, it ain't supposed to be no taxation. The central power ain't supposed to be taxing sovereign people. And commerce and unicameral Congress, right? The article was eventually replaced. These articles that were under the first government that was put together by these indigenous Native Americans were replaced by the United States Constitution in 1789 because George Washington became president in 1789, and then he rewrote the Constitution, right? And it says that the Articles were eventually replaced by the United States Constitution in 1789 as the central government weakness led to economic and political instability. You understand? This is what they did. They caused economic instability, and then George Washington rewrote the Constitution, and then they put us under a central banking system which controlled the central government that enslaved the people economically. So the first government was the Article of Confederation. And it was ratified in 1777 and 1781. The one that was ratified in 1781, that was the second United States that was put together by George Washington, who put us under the federal system. Understand? So let's get back to the 14 presidents before George Washington. It says the 14 presidents before George Washington, there were several presidents under the Articles of Confederation. There were Articles of Confederation that these indigenous people that came together in Congress went by, right? It says the 14 presidents before George Washington. John Hanson. John Hanson was the first black president of Maryland. He was a black man, right? He was part of the Articles of Confederation, the first government of the United States. And you can see him on a $2 bill. You turn the back of a $2 bill, you'll see John Hanson sitting amongst the first founding fathers, who were Nubian people, black melanated Nubian people, right? It says the second one was John Hancock. Now, how many of y'all knew John Hancock was part of the first United States government, which was under the Articles of Confederation? And John Hancock was a black man, right? He said, who presided over the Continental Congress before George Washington and was selected as the first president of the United States under the new Constitution. While the office of president was established after the Constitution, the position of president of the United States in Congress assembled existed before, making these figures the de facto president of the early American government. Presidents under the Article of Confederation, these men were not presidents of the United States in the same way George Washington was. What they mean by that these independent states who were in a political union, who had their own presidents, wasn't a president the same way like how George Washington became a president. So when the new United States was created, after they conquered the first United States that were already here and set up by the indigenous Native Americans, they changed the whole way of what how a president does what he do. You understand? The first government that was under the Article of Confederation, they weren't presidents like how George Washington was. They maintained their sovereignty and they worked together, and nobody wasn't trying to dominate and control each other. The new United States that George Washington put together was trying to do just that. That's why they created a federal system under the Federal Reserve Bank. And the states became subordinate to that central government, which was being controlled by the Federal Reserve Bank. The first government wasn't like that. And so here go the 14 presidents before George Washington. And these are all black indigenous people of the Americas. John Hanson, November 1718 to November 1782. The second one, Elis Bodina, November 1782 to November 1783. Thomas Mufflin, November 1783 to June 1784. Richard Henry Lee, November 1784 to November 1785. John Hancock. Not too many people knew John Hancock was a black man, right? He was in the first government, and he was a part of the founding fathers of the second government of the United States, which was the corporation. John Hancock ruled, well, I shouldn't say rule, was president from November 1785 to June 1786. Nathaniel Gorham, he was president from June 1786 to February 1787. Arthur St. Clair, February 1787 to January 1788. Cyrus Griffin, June 1788 to April 1789. It says the first president, George Washington, he was the first president elected under the United States Constitution, served from 1789 to 1797. Remember, George Washington started the second United States that was under the federal system that was being controlled by the Federal Reserve Bank. He the one that brung in that. The first 14 presidents, they were under the Article of Confederation, and they had a political union of sovereign states, meaning that each state had their own president. And these were, and this is the two United States. And so I hope y'all understand what the two United States were, how they were formed, and see how black people conquered black people. Because in history, they try to make it like it was all just white Europeans that came over here and colonized, that enslaved blacks and so forth. No, the true story is it started out from black elite Moors that came from Europe, who were part of the black nobility there, and they got with your Indo-Aryans or your Indo-Germans, assimilated together, and they came over here and colonized and enslaved their own people, or used those Germanic tribes to enslave their own people. And those Germanic tribes became your English, your Dutch, your Portuguese, Spain, right? What was the other country that came over here that colonized? Matter of fact, before I go, let me... Give me 1 minute. Because I want to give y'all all the names. So those Germanic tribes that assimilated into the black nobility, and the black nobility, the kings and the queens, the dukes, the earls, they started using these Germanic tribes after they assimilated them into their royal court to colonize over here in America. And those Germanic tribes became Spain, France, Great Britain, which is England, the Netherlands, right? They were the ones that were working for the black nobility to conquer their own people and enslave their own people, which were your Native Americans, the 5 civilized tribes, the Iroquois, you understand? And take land and resource away from them. It says the main European countries that colonized America were Spain, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, each establishing large colonial empires with significant territories, claimed distinct motivations. Other European nations included Portugal and the Vikings, also earlier exploratory and settlement efforts in America. Your Norsemen, your Vikings, were your Indo-Germans that came from Central Asia. They were chased out of Central Asia by Attila the Hun, and they spread it into Europe, into different parts of Asia like India, Maldives, what's the other, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. These are different parts of Asia, Southeast Asia. You understand? And then some of them came over into Europe, and they assimilated themselves in the black nobility, and they became Spain, they became France, they became Great Britain, the Netherlands, they became Portugal, and they became the Vikings. And they came over here and colonized different parts of America, robbing and stealing, killing the Native Americans, stealing land and resource from them. But you got to remember, these black Germans or these black Indo-Aryans and Europeans, they were being controlled behind the scenes by the black European nobility family, your elite Moors. You understand? And they were the ones, after they conquered the Native Americans, created the second United States under George Washington and the founding fathers, you understand, who also were black and melanated people. You understand? And this is why we're living under the system that we're living now, under the United States Corporation, this federal system that's being ran by the Federal Reserve Bank and the Zionist parasites that take advantage of the citizens, enslave them economically. You understand? So I hope y'all like the bill. I hope y'all come to my YouTube page, not my YouTube, my YouTube page where I'm starting my podcast. The name of the podcast, once again, is called Rational Lens, right? Podcast where logic comes into focus. And I hope y'all follow me over there. I'm still gonna be doing my Facebook stuff, but I'm gonna start really getting this podcast thing together with the help of my sister, and we probably can blow up, you know what I'm saying? So I can reach everybody the way I need to reach them. So I hope everybody have a good night. I hope y'all like the bill. Any questions, hit me up. And if I can answer them, I answer them. And I hope everybody have a good night and peace.